Hail Eris. All hail Discordia, okay. So I was asked to give an update on the Discordian archives. Who has heard of the Discordian archives? Quite a few. Let me give you a little background first. Back in the late 80s, 90s, I was involved in the zine scene. I came across this character named Kerry Thornley. Very fascinating guy who was connected to all these conspiracies and was involved in the JFK assassination in some odd way. So I got interested in this guy, and somewhere in the early 90s, an author named Jonathan Vankin wrote a book called Conspiracies, Cover-Ups, and Crimes. And one of the chapters was dedicated to Kerry Thornley, and it blew my mind, you know. And Vankin said at that time he was considering writing a book on Thornley, and I would have been the first one to buy a copy, you know, but he never got around to it. So I started kicking around the idea kind of later in the 90s, corresponded with Kerry a bit. And then he died around 98, and so I was gathering source materials and getting close to the point where, yeah, I'll try writing this book. And in 2000, I got kind of a cryptic email from a guy named Bob Newport. And in that it stated, I didn't know Newport from Adam, but in that Newport stated that Greg Hill had passed away. Greg Hill, the co-founder of Discordianism, also known as Malaclips the Younger, omnibenevolent polyfather of virginity and gold. I think I got all that right. OPVIG is the acronym there. And so I asked, you know, I was curious. I had no idea how Newport knew to get a hold of me, and I've asked him in recent years. I wonder if Bob's here. I sent him an email about this thing, but I don't see him. He doesn't really remember either, so it was all kind of synchronistic how it all came together. And so I started dialoguing him. Newport was real good friends with Bob Wilson, quite a connection there, which is another story in itself. And so we started dialoguing and somehow arranged an interview with Wilson and Newport at his place here in Capitola. It was a great experience, and Newport brought along what he called the Discordian archives, and it was just an armload of stuff he brought in. Some really great material that I ended up using in my book, The Prankster and the Conspiracy. That came out in 2003, but there was enough there for another book, you know, so I asked him, would you be cool if I published a book out of the rest of this material? And he's always cool with that. You know, that was like 2001. So time passed. I'd connect up with him every couple of years. And in 2009, I said, I'm getting much more serious about doing this. You still cool with it? And he said, yeah. And next time you're down in LA, drop by and I'll give you everything. So I didn't know what everything was, but it ended up being just, I say 5 boxes to coincide with the Discordian law of fives, but there were several boxes of materials that basically Newport, after Greg Hill had died, it was helping clean out his place. It would have ended up in the dumpsters if he hadn't retrieved it. And he had been planning a website of this material, but he got into landscape painting and other things, and gave it to me, and I was blown away because there was just amazing stuff in there. Letters, just tons of letters. Greg Hill was very meticulous, like a lot of people were back in the day. Anytime he'd send out a letter, there was a carbon copy. And then, you know, the letters he got back from Robert Anton Wilson and Shea, Kerry Thornley, Camden Benares, all those names you hear connected with Discordian. So, you know, there was like a chain in the chronology. So that's part of the archives. There's all the Operation Mindfuck letters. There's different versions of the Principia Discordia. It's just amazing stuff. There's a unpublished Robert Anton Wilson book in there as well. So a lot of cool stuff. Background. So that's the basic archives there. Produced a few books out of this, The Prankster and the Conspiracy, Historia Discordia, and another book called Caught in the Crossfire. And other material has gotten incorporated into the Discordian archives. There's a lady named Louise Lacey, and she was another early Discordian. Her name was Lady LFAB, for fucking anarchist bitch. That's a term of endearment, and there's a whole story behind that. But she gave me a box load of material, and it was similar, you know, those letters with carbon copies. And she went way back with Thornley and friends with Bob Wilson. Then I also got some material. Anybody remember Illuminate Press? Probably a few, yeah. I'd been corresponding with Ron Bonds. He was the publisher of Illuminate Press, and Thornley died in '98, and Ron Bonds died of a weird food poisoning thing about a year and a half later. I had talked to him at one point. He had some boxes of Thornley stuff, and we were going back and forth. Anyway, he died. I knew about this material, and I contacted his wife later because she had put out an email about wanting to sell some of the materials, and I asked about the boxes, and she didn't get back to me. She was kind of gave her some space. She was just getting over the death of her husband. But then 2012, I contacted her about some copyright stuff regarding Carrie Thornley, and once again, she was like, if you're ever in LA, there's some boxes of Thornley stuff. So I ended up with that material too. It's wasn't as well organized. It's out in Atlanta right now, and a friend of mine is holding it for me. He's going through it, and every time he goes through a new file, there's stems and steeds, and old marijuana falls out from about 20 years ago. So that's my buddy Groucho Gandhi, and he is the webmaster and helps with the content for the Historia Discordia site. So I think I've given you the background. What am I forgetting here? Okay, so what is new? So there's different books that'll come out of this. I talked about the unpublished book, Starseed Signals. It's kind of an early version of Cosmic Trigger, and also his Wilson's work with Leary during the period Leary was in prison. And then Leary got out, and the book kind of fell by the wayside. So there's that is sitting there. And you wonder how some of this stuff ends up in the archives. Greg Hill, around the period of the early 70s, he later worked for Bank of America in the word processing department, basically set up the word processing program for B of A, but earlier in the 70s, he was doing the same type of thing for a law firm, and he oversaw a small group of word processors, so he had access on the Schneid copying machines, and that's how I came across this manuscript that Bob had actually, Greg was giving Bob help basically creating about 10 copies of this manuscript so he could ship it off to different places. So that's kind of the relationship they had back then. There's other materials. I'd like to do a book of letters I've been kind of compiling and writing some commentary over time. There's also a real interesting project I'm working on with my buddy Groucho Gandhi called the Paste Up Discordia, which are the actual paste ups of the 4th edition of the Principia Discordia, the most famous version. It's pretty amazing to see these paste ups because you can see how, if you guys are familiar with Principia Discordia, how Greg Hill pasted all this stuff together. And this would be a full color book so you could actually see how this came together. This came about through Lumpanics. Principia Discordia, the 4th edition, the one that's talked about in Illuminatus, was 1970. After Illuminatus came out, people started asking about, the hell, is this a real book, Principia Discordia, you know, these characters? And Michael Hoy at Lumpanics got a hold of, I think first, Bob Wilson, and got a copy of the Principia Discordia. And later he talked to Greg Hill, and Hoy asked him about these paste ups. And that's what they used for that Lumpanics edition of Principia Discordia, if you've seen that. And what's also, we have all the letters that are going back and forth, Greg Hill and Michael Hoy, and I was talking to Eric about this the other day. There's a real interesting one that's handwritten contract by Greg Hill for the Principia Discordia. It looks like he basically states what may be the first instance of Creative Commons in a contract, all rights reversed. So it's pretty interesting, the influence these guys had. You know, Greg Hill, for instance, everybody knows Bob, who is into this scene, but for many years, people didn't even know if Greg Hill was a real guy. For some reason, people think he was made up. But so what else? So those are the,
The mentioning of the word process is making me wonder whether, in addition to having access to a photocopy machine, were these people using word processors before anybody else?
Greg Hill. And there's some, I'm not really into that word, but there's some coding stuff that people have found that might have had to do with Greg Hill going back to the 70s and 80s where they were using the all rights reversed stuff and coding. It's not really,
Easter eggs in the program?
yeah, so it's not really in my wheelhouse, but
You know, there's the ASCII code. There are lots of codes that aren't used. The amount of letters you can code is smaller than the number of ASCII codes. So on some computers, there was a number you could type, and you got a picture of Bob, Bill, the guy with the pipe.
Bob.
Bob, yeah, Bob Dobbs. You got a picture of Bob Dobbs instead of an A or a B or a C. And only very few people knew this. So he may have been responsible for that.
So,
I don't know.
so it's, yeah, that kind of thing. Greg Hill came up supposedly with one of the first versions of the solitaire game. It's not the one that sold, and he worked for Bank of America, started the word processing program for B of A. He worked for B of A for 23 years, which is interesting. And I'll try to wind this up.
You know, tell us your Discordian name.
The Wrong Reverend Houdini Kundalini of the Church of Unwavering Indifference. Let me mention one more thing. You hooked up with Adam Curtis. I did. Yeah. He came out and interviewed me about these guys, and he really considers Bob, of course, but Greg Hill to be a significant to the counterculture, what went right with the counterculture and what went wrong with the counterculture. He ended up interviewing me, and some of this might end up in a film at some point. So that's all these things going on, this resurgence going on nowadays with your play and Hilaritas Press and all the other things you mentioned a little while ago. So there you have it. That's the update.